The link between 9/11 and the new atheism is well established, but that terrible day also spurred another lesser known response to religious zeal. I speak of the apatheist response celebrated by Jonathan Rauch in a pithy but very influential 2003 essay in Atlantic Monthly titled Let It Be. Rauch begins this brief 994 word essay in memorable fashion by recounting an occasion where he was asked to share his religious views. I used to call myself an atheist, I said, and I still don't believe in God. But the larger truth is that it has been years since I really cared one way or another. I'm, and that's when it hit me, an apatheist. Rouse seems to suggest that he coined the term apatheism at that moment of hazy inspiration. In fact, the term predates Roush's usage. Nonetheless, Roush's brief discussion has elicited significant attention from Christian theologians since its publication, and as such, his treatment of the concept is worthy of closer consideration. The origin of the word is clear enough. Apatheism is a portmanteau, a combination of two words, apathy and theism. As such, it is hardly surprising that many interpreters take Rausch to be endorsing apathy, not caring about theism. Given that God is defined by theologians standardly as a being of maximal goodness, power, and knowledge who created and sustains the universe and with whom human flourishing is interwoven, so our flourishing depends on our relationship with this being. The apathetic dismissal of the topic itself would seem to represent a paradigm case of intellectual ignobility or sloth. In the words of E.L. Maskell, if anyone finds that he if anyone says he finds this too difficult to believe, I shall respect his incredulity, though I shall try to resolve it. But if he says it is too dull to interest him or too trivial to be worth investigating, I shall be at a loss to imagine what in heaven or earth he would consider to be exciting or important. I don't dispute that Rausch's essay includes this concept of apatheism as apathy or just not caring. But in this video, I want to seek to argue that Rausch is primarily concerned with a second type or expression of apatheism, that which I will call apatheism as restraint. According to this concept, apatheism consists of a concerted attempt to chasten the human tendency toward fanaticism in religious commitment, as expressed in antisocial behavior, such as zealotry, bigotry, and affrontive expressions of proselytism and disputation, even bordering in cases on violence. When viewed from the perspective of commending restraint, we can see that Rausch's brief essay represents a helpful cautionary attitude toward extremism. Well, Rausch's essay is commonly interpreted by Christian theologians and apologists to commend apathy as a way to negate religious zealotry. Uh, I want to consider a representative example of this interpretation. It's one of the most sophisticated that I've come across. It's courtesy of Douglas Groothuis in his book Christian Apologetics. Groothuis says that the apatheist of Rausch's essay has a relaxed attitude toward religion, a benign indifference in which one refuses, quote, to become passionate about one's own beliefs or the beliefs of others. Importantly, Groothuis recognizes that apatheism, like new atheism, is an intentional response to the danger of fanaticism. However, while the new atheists responded to religious fanaticism with their own secular versions, Rausch's apatheism targets all fanaticism, whether it be religious or secular. As Groothuis puts it, Rausch is seeking to provide a tonic to incivility that exudes the virtue of tolerance. While Groothuis recognizes that Rausch's apatheist seeks to avoid fanaticism, he also insists that Rausch thereby places tranquility above truth. In short, Groothuis believes that Rausch's pursuit of civility is a misbegotten attempt to secure peace at the cost of setting aside critically important theological, metaphysical, and ethical questions. This attitude, so Groothuis says, is antithetical to the teaching of all religions and sound philosophy, that we should care about our convictions and put them into practice consistently. In short, Groothuis charges Rausch with a toxic attitude of intellectual disinterest, which dissolves into a fundamentally anti Christian intellectual sloth. As Grotius sees it, the real cost of Rausch's misguided response to dogmatic incivility is a failure to love God or neighbor. He makes the point by quoting Rausch's observation that his Christian friends, quote, betray no sign of caring that I am an unrepentantly atheistic Jewish homosexual. As Grotius soberly observes, for the serious Christian, however, an attitude of apathy over the eternal destiny of another human being is not an option. Consequently, although apatheism may be born of a noble desire to avoid conflict, it sacrifices the pursuit of truth in the process and thereby becomes a textbook case of a cure that is worse than the disease. As I said, I don't dispute that one can find an ignoble apathy about theism and related metaphysical and existential questions in Rausch's essay. That is implied, at the very least, by his opening recollection of stumbling upon the idea after a couple of glasses of Merlot. Rausch does indeed appear to convey an apathetic attitude toward religion, as when he writes, quote, it has been years since I really cared one way or another. Thus, one could reasonably conclude that his own personal attitude toward God and religion is indeed somewhat apathetic. However, the fact that Rausch describes in his personal autobiography a lack of interest in religion should not be confused with the concept of apatheism that he then defends, which I believe is a concept that is a type of restraint, one which is quite equivalent actually to Plato's vision of enkrateia, or an exercise of self control over one's emotions and actions. This reading of restraint and discipline begins with the point that Grotius himself makes, namely that Rausch proposes apatheism as a way to avoid the danger of fanaticism. It is also important to underscore that Rausch's target is not religious fanaticism per se, rather, it is fanaticism generally, including that of secularists and atheists. This is how Rausch puts it. He says, quote, the hot-blooded atheist cares as much about religion as does the evangelical Christian, but in the opposite direction. Secularism can refer to a simple absence of devoutness, but it more accurately refers to an ACLU style disapproval of any profession of religion in public life, a disapproval that seems puritanical and quaint to apatheists. Thus, Rausch has as little sympathy for the hot blooded atheist fighting against religion as for the fire and brimstone street preacher fighting for it. In short, for Rausch, the problem is not which theological view you are fighting for, but rather the fact that you are fighting at all. At this point, it may help to illustrate the kind of behavior that Rausch is seeking to avoid. To that end, let me give you a couple examples. So, first example, when I was a teenager, I was taught that we had to do street evangelism by going out and accosting strangers on the sidewalk with this question: do you know where you would go if you died tonight? I still remember two young ladies shaking off our religious intervention with a forceful response: leave us alone. But my evangelistic companion was undeterred, and he followed them down the sidewalk, calling after them with increasing fervency, but you have to believe. Well, I was kind of embarrassed by all of this, so instead I channeled my evangelistic fervor in another direction by finding a newspaper box that was holding copies of the Jehovah's Witness publication Awake, taking them all out of the box because they were free, and then throwing them all into a dumpster. If we couldn't win souls, at least we could prevent the JWs from damning them. But again, zealotry is not limited to religious people. Here's a recollection that Barbara Ehrenreich gave in an essay years ago about growing up in a secular household. She says, I was raised in a real strong secular humanist family, the kind of folks who ground you for weeks just for thinking of dating a Unitarian or worse. Not that they were hardliners, though. We had over 70 Bibles lying around the house where anyone could browse through them. Gideon's my dad had removed from the motel rooms he'd stayed in. And I remember how he gloried in every Gideon he lifted, thinking of all the traveling salesmen whose minds he probably saved from dry rot. Looking back, I guess you could say I never really had a choice. What with my parents always preaching, think for yourself, think for yourself. Whether the issue is a wannabe Christian evangelist preaching repentance and destroying competing religious literature, or a secular evangelist preaching free thought as he steals Gideon Bibles. The same fanaticism is on display. Both Teen Randall and this secular father were exhibiting zealotry, the expression of excessive zeal in their beliefs. Further, this zeal expressed itself as bigotry and intolerance toward the beliefs of others, particularly as evident in the attempt to censor the literature and expressions of competing perspectives on reality. And finally, both exhibited an affrontive style of proselytism and disputation, whether it was Teen Randall accosting people on the street with the threat of hell and then throwing away the literature, or this father always preaching, think for yourself, and then stealing Bibles. Like Rausch, I applaud the move away from this kind of antisocial, in your face fanaticism, whether it is religious or secular. And that brings me to a critical point. Rausch's apatheism as restraint is not simply a matter of becoming lazy about religious belief. It is a sober and determined commitment to chasten our own innate impulses toward fanatical zealotry, bigotry, and affrontive proselytism. There's a good reason why this is worth considering. Everyone is familiar with the maxim, never discuss politics or religion in polite company, and we all know why. Religion and politics are topics which are uniquely able to inflame passion and stoke division. Given that human beings regularly have a tendency toward fanaticism and conflict in matters of religion and irreligion, Rouse's proposal is that we determine to guard ourselves against that impulse to lapse into zealotry and bigotry. He puts the point like this: it is the product of a determined cultural effort to discipline the religious mindset, and often of an equally determined personal effort to master the spiritual passion. It's not a lapse, it is an achievement. This is the critical point. Rausch's apatheism is not simply not caring. It's not a lapse. It is an achievement. It is a discipline to chasten your radicalizing tendencies. Far from being intellectual or lazy, it could be virtue. Consider another incendiary field, politics. So, a married couple, Steve and Darlene, are traveling to Steve's parents' house for Thanksgiving just after the 2024 election. Both Steve and Darlene campaigned for Kamala Harris, but Steve's dad was a big Trump supporter. As they drive, Darlene coaches Steve, do not get into an argument with your dad about Donald Trump. Don't take the bait, Steve. I don't care if your dad wears his MAGA hat and chants lock her up all through dinner. I forbid you to talk about politics. You need to control yourself. That same advice that Darlene gives to Steve to avoid an incendiary topic and with it to risk lapsing into fanatical behavior. This is the discipline that we are talking about. I recently saw a t-shirt that read, if you can't afford seminary, pick a fight with a Calvinist and get lectures for free. The shirt elicits a laugh and a knowing nod from people because they've met the Calvinist who is exceptionally earnest in sharing his or her beliefs, usually his beliefs. Nor is this tendency limited to Calvinism. Indeed, Christian history is littered with the carnage of religious extremism that occasionally verged into the fanatical and violent. Philip Melanchthon, the younger contemporary of Martin Luther, talked on his deathbed about looking toward death as a promise, a release to escape the rage of the theologians. He's talking about undisciplined fanaticism. Now, before we conclude, we should consider what Rausch says about Christians who are apatheists. This is particularly important because while Grotius's reading would make some of Rausch's statements appear especially damning, when read with the appropriate nuance I am advocating, they actually may be admirable exercises of holy wisdom congruent with love of God and neighbor. But before we get there, let's take a look at Rausch's own comments and how they do appear to be problematic when read through the lens that Grotius is advocating. Rausch writes in the essay, most Christian people that he knows believe in God but don't care much about him. Then he goes on and he says this, I have Christian friends who organize their lives around an intense and personal relationship with God, but who betray no sign of caring that I am an unrepentantly atheistic Jewish homosexual. They are exponents, at least, of the more important part of apatheism, the part that doesn't mind what other people think about God, unquote. Thus, Rausch here describes what he says are Christians who don't care much, seemingly, about either God or neighbor. And yeah, that could seem damning. So you might wonder whether this could really be an attitude that is redeemed. But while that might seem to be a problem, I would argue a closer reading can defend Rausch and his friends against this charge. While Rausch says the apatheistic Christians don't care much about God, he immediately then adds that he knows many apatheistic Christians who nonetheless organize their lives around an intense and personal relationship with God. This presents us with a puzzle. How can it be that the same individuals do not care about God, but yet they organize their an intensive personal relationship in their lives around belief in and discipleship to God? The answer I would suggest is that Rausch is using the word care, they don't care, in a very particular way with respect to the expressions of religious fanaticism. In other words, care is understood here to be measured in terms of visible displays of devotion and piety and zealotry. But it should be clear to any Christian that such visible displays do not thereby constitute a truly devotional life. Indeed, they may even run counter to it. For example, when Jesus instructs his disciples on the discipline of prayer, he advises them to pursue private devotions rather than grandiose public displays, Matthew 6. The so-called publicly visible prayer has little to do with the fulsome, true love of God. But what about Rausch's observations that his Christian friends, quote, betray no sign of caring about who he is as an unrepentantly atheistic Jewish homosexual? Once again, we need to keep in mind Rausch's very particular understanding of caring. These Christians may not, quote unquote, care in the sense of engaging in public and visible displays whereby they confront and condemn Rausch, his beliefs, his actions, but that hardly entails that they do not truly care about him. Indeed, for all we know, they may pray for him for hours a day. Keep in mind that Rausch knows these individuals have deeply devout Christian faith. Their religious commitment is no secret to him. Furthermore, it would presumably be commonly understood among them that he's not currently interested in religion, but if he were to be, surely their door would be open for conversation. So it should be no surprise then that his friends have not opted to engage him at this time because he's not interested. It would simply be at the risk of further alienating him. Rather than interpret that as not caring in the conventional sense, or in the sense that Grotius might suggest, we could interpret them as exercising wise restraint, holding back on a further presentation of their beliefs that they anticipate to be unwelcome, and instead sharing life with their friend. To be sure, maybe another Christian would prefer a more engaged and evangelistic encounter with Rausch, but it's doubtful that that would be very productive. I don't see anything that is lacking in virtue about Rausch, what Rausch describes in his friends. To conclude, in this video, I've sought to argue that while a superficial reading of Rausch's concept of apatheism may suggest it is a lowbrow apathy lacking in virtue, I think a more careful reading suggests it is a discipline that controls religious passions and the impulse to zealotry, something from which Christians and atheists could both benefit. It is a virtue, I believe, that is much needed in our world today.